Hey everyone, welcome back to Revenge Depth, the channel where we uncover the stories that cut deepest, where betrayal and justice collide. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. It was Thanksgiving morning. The streets were frosty, a sharp 5-degree wind slicing through the town, and I had no idea what I was about to see. I didn't plan this visit. I just drove over to my son's house without a word. I wanted to check on my grandson, my little boy, who should have been warm and safe, excited for the holiday. What I saw made my blood run cold. There he was, shivering, standing on the street in nothing but a thin t-shirt and shorts. His little hands were trembling, his teeth chattering, and his face pale. I froze for a moment, shock taking over every sense. How could anyone, especially family, leave a child like this in such freezing conditions? I rushed to him, wrapping my coat around his shoulders, pulling him close. "Tommy, what's going on?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He looked up at me, eyes wide and full of both fear and relief. "Grandpa," he said softly, too timid to speak louder. Then I noticed movement inside the house. Windows glimmered with light, and the aroma of roasted turkey filled the air. My stomach twisted. I could see my own son, my daughter-in-law, and the rest of the family sitting inside, laughing, chatting, completely oblivious to the fact that Tommy was freezing outside. I felt a surge of anger I hadn't felt in years. My grandson, my little boy, the center of my heart, left outside while they enjoyed their holiday meal. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. The betrayal stung deeper than the cold. Then I acted. Without thinking, I kicked the door open. The sound echoed through the house. Everyone froze. Forks paused mid-air. Turkey plates wobbled. Conversation stopped. And I said 6 words that would change the atmosphere instantly. "He's been out here all morning." Every face went pale. Shock replaced laughter. My daughter-in-law's jaw dropped. My son's eyes widened. The cousins and aunts looked around, unsure if they had imagined it. And my grandson, still wrapped in my coat, watched silently, knowing someone had finally stepped in. For a moment, there was silence. Then panic. My son stumbled to the door, mumbling excuses. I didn't think he'd be out here that long." His voice faltered. The truth, loud and undeniable, hung in the air like a thick fog. I took a deep breath, holding Tommy close. "It's not about thinking," I said. "It's about doing what's right. No child should be left like this. Not today. Not ever." My voice, calm but sharp, cut through the room. The family sat in stunned silence. Some tried to protest, some looked guilty, and others just stared blankly, unable to process what had happened. The power of truth, backed by undeniable evidence, a shivering child outside while they dined comfortably, had struck harder than any argument ever could. I placed Tommy safely inside, settled him in front of the fireplace, and offered him a warm cup of cocoa. He sipped quietly, finally safe, finally warm. And I knew one thing. This Thanksgiving, the lesson had been delivered. Not with yelling, not with threats, but with reality. Sharp, unarguable, and unforgettable. And as I looked around the room, seeing faces pale and hands frozen mid-gesture, I realized something else. Family can betray in the smallest, most shocking ways. But justice, real, unmissable justice, hits harder than any storm. This was just the beginning. Today, the family learned what it feels like to face the consequences of neglect. And from now on, no child of mine would ever be ignored. Not for 1 second. The room was frozen in silence. My son couldn't even look me in the eye. My daughter-in-law's hands shook slightly as she set down her fork. The turkey sat untouched, steam curling from the plates like smoke from a warning signal. I held my grandson tightly, letting him feel the warmth he had been missing, the safety that should have been guaranteed. "Tommy, you're safe now," I whispered. His small body relaxed slightly, though the shock in his eyes didn't fade immediately. I stepped back, scanning the room. The living room, filled with the scent of roasted turkey and mashed potatoes, suddenly seemed empty. Not physically, but morally. Laughter and chatter had vanished, replaced with an uncomfortable weight. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was in the quiet, in the way no one had thought to check if the child was warm, fed, or even inside the house, I said slowly. Voice steady but commanding. This isn't just about missing a meal or a holiday tradition. This is about responsibility. And today, that responsibility was ignored. My son's face flushed red. I didn't think he'd be cold for that long, he mumbled, weakly trying to justify himself. Didn't think? I echoed, my tone sharper now. You didn't think. Do you understand what 5 degrees feels like to a 6-year-old standing in a t-shirt and shorts? Do you understand what fear feels like when the people who are supposed to protect you leave you out in the cold? He had no answer. The words hung in the air, as heavy as the chill Tommy had endured outside. I walked slowly to the kitchen, where a tray of untouched food sat. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The point had been made. A lesson doesn't require grand gestures. Sometimes the reality itself is enough to shift perspective. From now on, I said, turning back to face them, any time a child is neglected, any time someone is left in danger, there will be consequences. Today, you witnessed what happens when care is forgotten. My daughter-in-law tried to speak, but the words faltered. She opened her mouth and closed it again. The shame was palpable, sitting heavily between us. I knelt beside Tommy, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Grandpa's here. I'll always make sure you're safe. He nodded quietly, too overwhelmed to speak. His trust had been broken once already, and it would take time to rebuild. But at least now, he knew someone had his back. The rest of the family sat quietly, realizing that holidays, food, and comfort meant nothing if the most vulnerable were ignored. Their faces showed fear, guilt, and regret, emotions they had never truly experienced in such intensity. I could see it in my son's eyes. He understood, not just the danger Tommy had faced, but the weight of the responsibility he carried as a parent. And my daughter-in-law, she had no words, just a sense of helplessness as the truth sank in. It was a quiet Thanksgiving now, but the silence was filled with lessons. My grandson, once cold and alone, was now wrapped in warmth, both from the coat I'd thrown around him and the understanding that someone cared enough to act. And I knew this wasn't the end. Not for the lesson, not for the accountability that had been awakened. Family dynamics, trust, and safety had all been tested today, and while the pain of betrayal had cut deep, it had also sparked a change that could not be ignored. As I watched them, I made a silent promise. I would not allow negligence to slide by. I would not allow a child, especially my grandson, to suffer because of ignorance, laziness, or thoughtlessness. The holiday had become more than a meal. It had become a reckoning, and that evening, as the sun set over the frost-covered streets, I knew one thing for certain. The family would remember this Thanksgiving. Not for the food, not for the laughter, not for the decorations, but for the moment when responsibility met reality and when a little boy finally felt safe in the arms of someone who truly cared. The house was silent after the morning confrontation, but I knew the storm had only just begun. My grandson, now wrapped in blankets by the fireplace, finally seemed comfortable, but the tension in the air was thick enough to touch. I needed to make sure this negligence would never happen again, and that meant teaching a lesson they would never forget. I walked through the living room, letting my gaze linger on the family's frozen expressions. They hadn't expected me to arrive unannounced. They hadn't expected someone to see the truth firsthand. But the lesson didn't end with just shock. It had to be more. It had to leave a mark. Let me be clear, I said, my voice calm but filled with authority. This is not just about today. This is about every time a child is ignored, neglected, or left vulnerable. From now on, there are boundaries. There are rules, and those who break them will face consequences. My son shifted uncomfortably. We understand, he stammered, but I wasn't done. Understanding wasn't enough. They needed to feel the weight of responsibility. I glanced toward the door, thinking quickly. My mind raced with ideas, ways to teach a lesson that would resonate not through anger or punishment alone, but through reality. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. Tomorrow, I continued, we're going to take a walk outside, all of us. My grandson first in a proper coat and warm clothes. You will witness how dangerous it is out there when he is unprotected. You will understand the stakes. You will understand fear. You will understand what neglect looks like." Their eyes widened. My daughter-in-law swallowed hard, realizing that this wasn't going to be easy for them. The reality of the cold, the truth of their oversight, was going to hit in a way they had never experienced before. That night, I stayed by the fireplace with Tommy. I told him stories, made him laugh, and watched him drift to sleep safely. Every now and then, I thought about how close he had come to danger, and my chest tightened. But I also felt a strange relief that I had acted in time, relief that someone had finally stepped up. The next morning, the plan went into motion. I had prepared warm clothing, gloves, hats, scarves, everything necessary for a child to survive freezing temperatures. My son and daughter-in-law watched silently as I dressed Tommy carefully, ensuring every layer was snug and warm. "Are you ready?" I asked gently. Tommy nodded, excited for the adventure but unaware of the lesson about to unfold. We stepped outside. The cold hit like a wall. Frost crunched underfoot. The wind bit through even my thick coat. And then I handed Tommy a small stick to measure the depth of the frost on the ground, letting him experience the cold safely while the adults watched. "You see," I said, pointing to the biting wind and the frozen ground. "This is what you left him in yesterday. This is what neglect looks like. Imagine standing here unprotected, shivering, scared. This is reality." My son's face went pale. My daughter-in-law bit her lip, tears forming in the corner of her eyes. They had felt nothing yesterday, enjoyed their meal oblivious to the danger. But now, seeing it firsthand, they understood. Tommy giggled in his layers, unaware of the lesson, enjoying the safe adventure. But for the adults, the memory of yesterday's negligence struck hard. They were silent, humbled, ashamed. And in that silence, I knew the lesson had taken root. We returned indoors. Tommy, warm and happy, ran off to play, and I faced the adults, my gaze steady. "Today you learned responsibility. You learned accountability. But remember this, the next time there may not be a warning. You must never put him at risk again." They nodded, fully aware that I wasn't joking. This wasn't about punishment. It was about creating awareness, about teaching a lesson that could save a life. And in that moment, I realized the power of action over words, how seeing the consequences of one's neglect could change behavior permanently. As the day went on, laughter returned to the house, but now it was different. It was cautious, thoughtful. A family had been reminded of the stakes, and I knew that the lesson would resonate long after the holiday was over. And somewhere in the warmth of the house, I felt a quiet pride. Not for myself, but for having protected my grandson, for making sure he understood that someone always had his back, and for ensuring that, from this day forward, neglect would never be tolerated under my roof again. The warmth of the house couldn't mask the tension that still lingered. My grandson played nearby, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just passed, while the adults in the room sat quietly, digesting the lesson of responsibility they had just witnessed. I knew this was only the beginning. Awareness alone wasn't enough. Actions needed to follow. And I had a plan to ensure that my grandson would never be left vulnerable again. "From now on," I said, my voice calm but firm, "you will learn what it means to put family first. Every decision, every action, it must consider his safety and well-being. No excuses, no distractions." My son shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We understand," he mumbled, but I could see the apprehension in his eyes. Understanding wasn't enough. They had to internalize the consequences of negligence. I took a deep breath and continued. "Tomorrow, you will accompany me and Tommy on a small trip, a test, if you will. You will see the world through his eyes, feel what he feels, and understand the fragility of his safety." Their faces paled at the thought. A lesson in reality, beyond words, was exactly what they needed. And I knew it. The next morning I packed warm coats, gloves, scarves, and boots. Tommy was excited, his small face lighting up with anticipation. The adults followed silently, a mix of dread and realization in their expressions. We stepped outside. The air was crisp, the frost still clinging to the ground. I handed Tommy a small notebook and asked him to note how cold he felt at different points during our walk. It was a simple exercise for him, but for the adults, it was a revelation. "You see this?" I said, pointing at the icy patches and the wind biting through our coats. "This is what it's like when you leave someone unprotected. This is what neglect feels like." My son's eyes widened, and my daughter-in-law's hands clenched nervously. They were seeing firsthand the danger they had ignored yesterday. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real, palpable, and unavoidable. Tommy giggled as he scribbled in his notebook, oblivious to the tension around him. But the adults were silent, absorbed in the lesson. I could see the shame settling in, the weight of accountability pressing down on them. We walked for about an hour, enough time for them to understand fully the severity of their negligence. I watched them carefully, noting every reaction, every hesitation, every moment of realization. The lesson was sinking in, deep and irreversible. Returning home, I made sure Tommy was warm, fed, and comfortable. The adults, however, were left to reflect on the gravity of their actions. Words alone had not sufficed. Seeing the danger firsthand had made the lesson unforgettable. Later, as the family gathered for a late breakfast, the atmosphere had shifted. There was respect now, a quiet acknowledgement that safety and responsibility were not optional. They had been humbled, and I knew that from this point forward they would act differently. I glanced at Tommy, happily eating his food, unaware of the turmoil his presence had sparked in the adults. I smiled quietly. He was safe, he was warm, and he had learned in his own small way the importance of vigilance. But I also knew this was a turning point. From this day forward, accountability would be the standard in this household. Negligence would not be tolerated, and anyone who failed to protect the most vulnerable would face consequences. Immediate and unforgettable, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting light across the frost-covered streets, I felt a sense of quiet victory. Not because of punishment, not because of anger, but because a lesson had been learned. And in that lesson, a family had been reshaped, for the better, for the safety of the child and for the future. The holiday had become more than a tradition. It had become a moment of reckoning, a turning point where responsibility met reality. And I knew deep down that no one in that house would ever forget it. The following morning, I woke to the quiet hum of the house. Tommy was already up, his small figure moving around the kitchen, searching for cereal. I watched him with a mixture of pride and relief. He was safe, warm, and oblivious to the storm that had swept through our home the day before. But the adults weren't so carefree. My son and daughter-in-law sat silently at the breakfast table, eyes lowered, unsure where to begin. The events of the past 2 days had shaken them deeply, and the reality of their negligence had settled like a weight upon their shoulders. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined them, keeping my voice calm but commanding. "Today," I said, "we continue what we started. Understanding alone isn't enough. You must take action to prove that lessons have been learned." They nodded, still hesitant, still haunted by the images of Tommy shivering outside. I could see their guilt, and I knew it was a fertile ground for change, but I also knew that guilt needed direction. "We're going on another walk," I continued, "but this time it won't just be about seeing the cold. It will be about learning to anticipate danger, to act before it's too late. Tommy will lead us, and you will follow." No excuses, no distractions, their faces paled. The thought of another lesson so soon after the first was daunting, but I didn't give them a choice. The stakes were too high, and my grandson's safety depended on their transformation. By mid-morning, we were ready. I dressed Tommy carefully, layering him in warm clothes and a thick jacket. He looked up at me with bright, trusting eyes, unaware of the intensity behind the plan I had crafted. As we stepped outside, the air was sharp, the frost still glittering under the weak morning sun. Tommy began to lead the way, pointing out small hazards, icy patches, uneven sidewalks, and exposed corners that could trip him. My son and daughter-in-law followed closely, their eyes darting nervously, minds racing as they absorbed every detail. This is what happens when you ignore your responsibilities. I said quietly. Every oversight has consequences. Every moment of carelessness can put a life at risk. Today you will see it all. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Their silence was a testament to their growing understanding, their realization of just how serious their actions had been. And as they watched Tommy navigate the tiny obstacles, carefully and safely, they were forced to confront their own failures. At one point, Tommy slipped slightly on a patch of ice, catching himself with his small hands on a railing. My son's breath caught in his throat. My daughter-in-law's face went pale. That single moment, brief as it was, drove home everything I had been trying to teach them. "Do you see?" I asked. "This could have been yesterday. This could have been real danger. You were lucky. And luck isn't a strategy." They nodded, swallowing hard, visibly shaken. For the first time, they truly understood. It wasn't enough to apologize or promise to do better. They had to internalize the lesson, carry it forward, and ensure that Tommy's safety was never in question again. By the time we returned home, the frost had melted slightly under the morning sun, but the impact of the walk remained. Tommy ran off to play, oblivious to the gravity of what had just happened. The adults, however, sat quietly, their expressions serious, their minds replaying the lessons over and over. I knew that the foundation for change had been laid. Their understanding was no longer abstract. It was tangible, reinforced by experience. And though the storm had not yet fully passed, the first steps toward responsibility had been taken. Later, as I watched Tommy build a small snow fort in the yard, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The family had faced the consequences of negligence and had begun to understand the weight of their actions. Change was possible, but vigilance, I knew, would be required every day moving forward. That night, I sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the events. The lesson had been harsh, but necessary, and in the warmth of the room, I allowed myself a small moment of pride in the fact that my grandson was safe, and pride in the knowledge that sometimes tough love is the only way to protect the ones you care about most. The following morning, the house felt heavier than usual. The memory of the previous walks, of Tommy shivering in the cold, lingered in every corner. I watched him play quietly with his toys, his laughter echoing through the halls. And I realized just how fragile innocence can be when left in the wrong hands. The adults were still tense, still processing the lessons of responsibility and accountability. My son kept glancing at me, as if silently asking what was next. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I observed, letting their discomfort build. Understanding needed to settle deep before actions could be meaningful. "Today," I said, finally breaking the silence, "we will take things a step further. Seeing the danger is one thing. Preventing it is another. You will demonstrate that you can anticipate risk and act decisively to protect what matters most." My daughter-in-law's hands clenched nervously. What do you mean?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "You will accompany me to a public park with Tommy. You will remain responsible for him at all times. Any lapse, any hesitation, and you will see just how quickly things can go wrong. You will understand that safety is not optional, it is a duty." Their faces paled. The idea of real-world accountability terrified them, but it was exactly what was needed. Words alone had never been enough. Now actions would speak louder than any lecture could. We arrived at the park, the winter air crisp and biting. Children were running about, parents chatting, and the environment seemed harmless. But I knew the real lesson lay in vigilance. Tommy, blissfully unaware, ran ahead, exploring the swings and slides, and it was up to them to follow. "Notice how quickly situations change," I said. "A moment of distraction can turn an ordinary afternoon into a disaster. You are responsible for his safety, no excuses." My son tripped slightly while adjusting Tommy's coat, and the fear in his eyes was immediate. He realized for the first time that his negligence could have serious consequences. My daughter-in-law, meanwhile, kept her gaze constantly on Tommy, checking every angle, every potential hazard. We walked, observed, and corrected. I offered guidance sparingly, letting them make mistakes, and then showing them how easily those mistakes could escalate. The lesson was tangible now, visceral, unforgettable. After nearly 2 hours, we returned home. The adults were exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. They had learned more in that short walk than they ever could have through words alone. And as I watched them settle, I could see a change taking shape, awareness, accountability, and a newfound respect for the responsibilities they had previously ignored. Later that evening, while Tommy slept soundly, I sat down with them in the living room. "You see now," I said gently but firmly, "that protecting those you love is not a choice. It is a responsibility you cannot ignore. The world is unpredictable, and if you do not act decisively, consequences follow, sometimes with no second chances." Their silence was telling. They had understood the weight of their actions. Fear had done what words could not. And yet, I knew the real test would come in everyday life, in moments small and large, where vigilance could not be optional. I allowed myself a quiet smile. The journey was far from over, but progress had been made. Tommy was safe for now, and the adults were beginning to internalize lessons that would last a lifetime. As I looked out the window at the frost-covered streets, I reflected on the events of the past week. The holiday had become more than a celebration. It had become a crucible, testing the bonds of family, the limits of patience, and the depth of responsibility. And through it all, one truth remained undeniable. The safety of the most vulnerable must always come first. The night settled in, and with it, a sense of accomplishment and cautious hope. Lessons had been taught, awareness had been raised, but the real measure of change would be seen in the days ahead, in the actions, decisions, and choices that would shape the future of this family. The morning after the park incident, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with anticipation. My son and daughter-in-law moved cautiously, as if every step might trigger another lesson. Tommy, blissfully unaware of the tension, played with his toys on the rug, his laughter ringing through the otherwise quiet house. But I knew the real test was about to begin. "Today," I said, gathering them in the living room, "we're going to see if you've truly understood what responsibility means. Awareness is not enough. You must demonstrate it under pressure." Their faces turned pale, a mix of fear and anxiety flashing in their eyes. This wasn't a drill or a casual suggestion. It was real, immediate, and unavoidable. I handed them a list of tasks. "You will be responsible for every decision Tommy makes today. Every action you take and don't take will have consequences. You are in charge completely, without supervision. Any mistake, and you'll witness the direct results." They exchanged worried glances. My son's hands fidgeted, and my daughter-in-law bit her lip nervously. The weight of responsibility finally began to sink in. We stepped outside, and the cold winter air bit at our faces. Tommy ran ahead toward the small neighborhood playground, his small legs moving quickly, fearless. But the moment he stepped near the icy edge of the slide, both adults tensed. One misstep here could have been disastrous. "Notice this," I said, standing back and observing. "A single lapse in attention can turn a normal day into a nightmare. The safety of someone you love is in your hands, every second." Throughout the morning, I let them make small errors, carefully controlled, showing them how quickly things could spiral. Tommy almost slipped several times, and each time the adults reacted, sometimes too slowly, sometimes with hesitation. I intervened only when necessary, letting fear guide their learning. By midday, the lessons had intensified. I introduced minor challenges: a distracted dog running through the park, a sudden trip on the icy path, even small obstacles that tested their vigilance. Each time I observed silently, noting how quickly they adapted, how their attention sharpened, and how panic or hesitation could cloud judgment. "This is what happens when you fail to anticipate danger," I said. "Every second counts. Every choice matters. You cannot rely on luck, only on awareness, vigilance, and decisiveness." Returning home, their exhaustion was evident. Faces pale, backs stiff, they carried the weight of the day in every movement. Tommy, unaware of the intensity he had inspired, ran to his room smiling, playing as if nothing had happened. But the adults understood. The lesson had sunk in, deep and unshakable. I gathered them in the living room once more. You have felt the fear of potential consequences. You have seen how quickly an ordinary moment can become dangerous. You understand now that vigilance is not optional. You are responsible, or always, for those who depend on you. Their silence was telling. They had internalized the lesson. But this was not about punishment. It was about transformation. Responsibility, accountability, and protection are not theoretical. They are lived, experienced, and acted upon, often under pressure, often in moments of crisis. As the sun began to set, I watched them prepare Tommy for dinner, checking his coat, his gloves, ensuring he had everything he needed. Their actions were deliberate, careful, and considered. The difference from earlier in the week was stark. Fear had worked its way into understanding, and understanding into habit. Later, as Tommy slept, I reflected on the progress made. The family dynamic had shifted, slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. What began as negligence, distraction, and carelessness was now replaced with attention, mindfulness, and a sense of accountability that would endure far beyond that day. I allowed myself a quiet nod of satisfaction. The lessons had been tough, the methods unconventional, but the results were undeniable. Tomorrow would be another test, and the future would reveal whether these changes were permanent. But for tonight, the house was safer, the family wiser, and Tommy protected. And as the night closed in, I realized that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones people don't forget. Lessons that stay with you, shaping choices and actions for a lifetime. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house was tense but strangely calm. The events of the past days had changed everything. My son and daughter-in-law moved deliberately, checking on Tommy, making sure he was safe, warm, and attended to. I watched from the window as the sun rose, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, illuminating the changes that had quietly taken root. Tommy played on the carpet, his tiny hands building towers with blocks, completely unaware of the storm that had raged in his family. But the adults were different now, cautious, attentive, and conscious of every action. Their earlier negligence had been replaced with a vigilance that came from experience and hard-earned lessons. I called them to the living room one last time. "Today," I said, "you will demonstrate everything you've learned. Awareness, responsibility, and the ability to act decisively. This is your final test." Their eyes widened, a mix of anxiety and determination. I handed them a scenario, a simulated emergency. Tommy's toy truck was stuck on the icy balcony, and they had to retrieve it safely. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and the consequences would be clear. The exercise began. I observed silently as they calculated each step, anticipating hazards, coordinating movements, and communicating effectively. Every decision mattered. Every pause, every glance, every action was deliberate. The tension in the room was palpable, but the growth was undeniable. When the scenario concluded, I allowed a small smile. "You see now," I said, "that responsibility is not just about following instructions. It is about presence, attention, and foresight. It is about understanding that lives, even the smallest ones, depend on your actions every second of every day." They nodded quietly, exhausted, but enlightened. Fear had transformed into understanding, panic into careful consideration, and negligence into accountability. Later that evening, Tommy slept peacefully wrapped in blankets, safe from the dangers of the past days. I walked through the house, noting the changes, the careful preparation of meals, the thoughtful placement of winter coats and gloves, the subtle but significant attention to detail. "This," I whispered to myself, "is what real transformation looks like. Not through threats, not through words alone, but through experience, awareness, and responsibility." I turned to my son and daughter-in-law, who now stood quietly by the fireplace, their faces a mixture of respect, relief, and understanding. "You have seen the consequences of your actions. You have learned that responsibility is not optional, and protection is not a choice. It is a duty." Their nods were small but sincere. Finally, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The lessons had been harsh, the methods intense, but the outcome was undeniable. Tommy was safe, and the family had grown stronger, wiser, and more attentive. The night settled over the neighborhood, a calm and reflective silence filling the house. I realized that the lessons we teach, though often difficult and uncomfortable, are the ones that shape the future. The fear, the tension, the vigilance, they all served a purpose to ensure that the next generation, represented by Tommy, would be cared for, protected, and valued. And as I watched my grandson sleep peacefully, I knew that sometimes the hardest lessons, learned in the cold light of reality, are the ones that stay with us for a lifetime. If this story shocked you, hit subscribe to Revenge Depth and turn on notifications. We reveal the real-life family dramas you won't believe. Comment below, have you ever faced a situation where responsibility and carelessness clashed in your family? Share your thoughts. We read everyone. Remember, some lessons are learned the hard way, but their impact lasts forever. Stay tuned for more gripping stories where trust, betrayal, and justice collide.